You are standing in a tunnel 40 feet under a modern Italian town, and the thing in your hands looks like a lump of charcoal. It weighs almost nothing. It crumbles if you breathe on it. And yet, inside that burnt cylinder, wound tight in the dark, is a human voice that has been screaming to be heard for almost 2,000 years. Here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. That lump of charcoal is a book. It was written before the destruction of Pompeii. It was buried by the same eruption. And for 270 years, every expert who touched one of these things destroyed it trying to open it, until a group of people used particle accelerators and machine learning to read a scroll that no human hand ever unrolled. What they found inside was not a lost gospel, it was something far stranger. I am going to show you the exact date the first word appeared on a screen, the name of the 21-year-old who found it, and the single detail buried in a synchrotron scan that rewrites what we thought Roman writers could even do. This is not legend. Every piece of this traces back to laboratory records and prize logs you can check yourself. I remember the night this stopped being a curiosity for me and became an obsession. I was reading an excavation report from the 1750s, and I hit a line where the diggers described pulling out what they thought were lumps of coal or fishing net weights and throwing them onto the fire to keep warm. That sentence made my stomach drop. They were burning books, lost books, and nobody knew. So let me take you back to where this cold case begins, because the official story has been told 100 times, and almost every version leaves out the part that keeps me up at night. The year is 1750. A Swiss engineer named Carl Weber is supervising well diggers near the town of Resina on the Bay of Naples. They are cutting vertical shafts down through solid volcanic rock, chasing marble and statues to sell. 60 feet down, they break into rooms. Not caves, rooms. Painted walls, mosaic floors, colonnades. They have accidentally tunneled into a Roman villa that was swallowed whole when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79. But this was no ordinary villa. It was enormous, over 250 yards of frontage along the ancient coastline, packed with bronze statues, so beautiful they now anchor an entire museum in Naples. The diggers hauled up more than 80 sculptures. And in a small room near the center, they found shelves. Wooden shelves lined with hundreds of little blackened cylinders. At first, nobody understood what they were looking at. The objects were black, brittle, and shaped like sticks or bricks. Some workers thought they were charcoal briquettes. Some thought they were rolls of burnt cloth. As I told you, some were simply thrown away or burned. It was only when one of them cracked open and revealed writing inside faint columns of Greek letters that the horror and the wonder set in at the same time. They were books, papyrus scrolls. An entire private library, the only one to survive intact from the ancient world, carbonized in place by the heat of the eruption and then sealed under 60 feet of rock for 1,670 years. We now call the building the Villa of the Papyri. And that library is the reason I could not walk away from this. Because here is the anomaly that the tidy version skips. The eruption did not simply bury these scrolls. It cooked them. Modern analysis of the carbonization puts the temperature that hit that room somewhere between 320 and 500 degrees Celsius. A superheated surge of volcanic gas and ash called a pyroclastic flow, moving faster than a car, hot enough to turn flesh to vapor and wood to charcoal in seconds. That heat is exactly what preserved the scrolls. It drove out the water and the life and left behind pure carbon that could not rot for 2,000 years. But it also welded them shut. And that is the trap. The very thing that saved these books made them, by every reasonable measure, impossible to ever open again. The first man to seriously try nearly answered it with brute patience, and in doing so, he showed everyone exactly how much these scrolls did not want to be read. His name was Father Antonio Piaggio, and he was a conservator brought down from the Vatican library around 1753. Piaggio looked at these carbonized lumps and did something that was, honestly brilliant for its time. He built a machine, a wooden frame with silk threads and tiny weights designed to lift the outermost layer of a scroll a fraction of a millimeter at a time, so slowly that the movement was almost invisible. He would sit and watch it for hours. A single scroll could take him 4 years to unwind, and it worked barely. Piaggio managed to peel open some of the rolls and expose columns of Greek text. For the first time, people could read fragments. They discovered the library was full of philosophy, specifically the work of a thinker named Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher who wrote about pleasure, music, poetry, and how a person should live. This told scholars something important about who owned the villa, but every peel destroyed as much as it saved. The machine cracked the layers. Ink flaked away. Entire sections turned to powder in the frame. By the end of the 1700s, the pattern was undeniable. To read one of these scrolls, you had to physically open it. And to physically open it, you had to damage it, often beyond recovery. Museums learned this lesson the hard way, through the 1800s and 1900s. Every new technique, soaking them in chemicals, peeling them with gelatin, slicing them apart, produced a little text and a lot of ruin. Hundreds of the scrolls were sacrificed. Many that survive today are in fragments precisely because someone tried to save them. So, a kind of quiet surrender settled over the whole field. The remaining unopened scrolls, and there were hundreds, sitting in a library in Naples, and a handful of other collections were declared too fragile to touch. The consensus hardened into something that sounded almost noble. We must leave them sealed. We owe it to the future. We cannot read them without destroying them, so we will not try. And that is where the story sat for decades. Sealed, filed away, case closed. But I want you to sit with how strange that surrender actually was, because the more I dug into it, the less it added up. We are talking about the only intact library to survive from Greek and Roman antiquity. Somewhere in those unopened rolls could be lost plays, lost histories, lost philosophy works we know existed only because ancient writers mentioned them, works that vanished when the last copies rotted in medieval monasteries. And the establishment position was to place them on a shelf and wait. Wait for what exactly? That was the thread I kept pulling. And that is where a computer scientist who had never studied classics walked in and refused to accept the answer everyone else had made peace with. His name is Brent Seals, a professor of computer science at the University of Kentucky. And his whole idea rested on a question so simple it sounds naive. What if you did not have to open the scroll at all? What if you could unroll it inside a computer? Seals had already proven the concept worked. Years earlier, he had taken a charred, lump-like scroll found near the Dead Sea, at a place called En-Gedi, that was every bit as hopeless as the Herculaneum rolls. Nobody could open it. So, in 2016, Seals and his team ran it through a high-resolution CT scan, the same kind of three-dimensional X-ray imaging a hospital uses, and then wrote software to find the crumpled layers of the scroll inside the scan, follow each surface through all its twists, and digitally flatten it out into a readable page. It worked. The En-Gedi scroll turned out to contain text from the book of Leviticus. They had read a book that no human had opened in more than 1,000 years, and they never touched the writing at all. So Seals pointed the same idea at the Herculaneum scrolls, and immediately he slammed into a wall that the Dead Sea Scroll had not put in his way. A wall made of chemistry. Here is the problem, and this is the detail that turns this from a nice story into a genuine mystery. The En-Gedi scroll was written in ink that contained metal, iron. Metal shows up brilliantly on an X-ray scan, glowing bright against the dark surface of the burnt paper, because dense metal blocks X-rays. That contrast is what let the software see the letters. But the ink on the Herculaneum scrolls was different. The Romans in this era wrote with carbon ink, essentially soot, fine black carbon scraped from lamps and mixed with a binder. And the scroll itself, after being carbonized by Vesuvius, is also carbon. So you have black carbon letters sitting on black carbon paper. On an X-ray scan, they are the same material. They have almost the same density. The writing is, in the most literal sense, invisible. Scanning a Herculaneum scroll should have shown you a beautifully detailed picture of a rolled-up blank page. That is the point where every rational person would have quit. And I want to speak directly to you if you are the skeptic in the room right now, because I was that skeptic, and this next part is built for you. You are thinking, fine, this is just a technical hurdle. They probably found some ordinary trick, contrast enhancement, a filter, nothing mysterious about it. Stay with me here, because the way out of this problem was not a trick. It was a discovery that quietly overturned something we thought we knew about the Romans themselves. Let me walk you through the honest, boring explanation first, the way I did when I was trying to debunk this. The reasonable assumption is that carbon ink on carbon paper is simply undetectable, full stop, and that the whole project was doomed from the start. For years, that assumption held. Seals's early scans, and scans done by other teams, showed the layers of the scroll gorgeously. You could trace the spiral of the wound papyrus, but you could not see a single letter. The ink was there, it just would not show up. Now here's where the ordinary explanation breaks. Back in 2016, a separate team, led by a physicist named Vito Mocella, working with the European synchrotron in Grenoble, France, had put Herculaneum fragments under a beam far more powerful than any hospital scanner. And in the years of analysis that followed, Researchers examining the ink of these scrolls found something that was not supposed to be there: lead. Traces of metal lead in particular embedded in the carbon ink. Not enough to see with the naked eye. Not enough to make the ink look any different, but enough that, under an intense enough X-ray source, the letters carried a faint metallic signature that pure carbon paper did not. So, the question that would torment scholars for the next 2.5 centuries was simple to ask and apparently impossible to answer. How do you read a book that turns to dust the moment you try to unroll it? Sit with that feeling for a second. You are holding a voice you cannot hear, a book you cannot open, evidence the official story quietly filed away as too fragile, too settled, case closed. That itch, the sense that the tidy version left out the part that actually matters, is the exact reason I put together the Lost Origins Complete Library. It is 3 evidence-based volumes that use AI, archaeology, and ecology to close the gap between what we are taught and what the data actually shows. In First Threshold, you get the full story of how AI-driven LiDAR and machine methods are uncovering things buried for thousands of years, the same kind of read-it-without-touching-it breakthrough you are watching tonight. Deep Signal hands you the grammar of evidence, how to read contested findings without getting fooled by the neat headline. And Hidden Systems, the bundle-exclusive casebook, ties every framework together so you can work a mystery like this one on your own. Here is something you can test tonight, for free. Pull up the excavation records and the Vesuvius Challenge prize logs I mentioned. The date, the name, the winning entry, and check them yourself. Every claim in that story is verifiable, and that is exactly the habit these books are built to sharpen. The fastest way to get the books is to scan the QR code right there on your screen, or go to the link in the description or the pinned comment. And this one is not going anywhere. The second library is still in the ground right now, the case still open, which is exactly why it is worth learning to read the evidence for yourself. Now, back to the tunnels and the man who refused to accept that these scrolls could never be opened. Think about what that means. The standard timeline said Roman writers did not routinely use metal-based inks until centuries later. The assumption was that first-century ink was pure carbon soot and nothing else. And yet, here was lead, sitting in the strokes of Philodemus, written before the year 79. That single finding did 2 things at once. It cracked open a path to reading the scrolls, and it told us the people who made these books were doing something with their ink that we did not know they were doing. But even that lead signature was almost impossibly faint. You could not just scan a scroll and read it. The metal traces were so subtle they were buried in the noise of the scan. Detecting them by eye was hopeless. You needed something that could learn to recognize the near-invisible fingerprint of ancient ink across billions of data points. You needed a machine that could see what a human never could, and that is exactly what happened next, in a way nobody expected because the people who finally cracked it were not archaeologists at all. In March of 2023, Brent Seals joined forces with 2 Silicon Valley figures, Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross, and they did something the academic world would never have dared. They took the highest resolution scans ever made of an intact Herculaneum scroll captured at a British particle accelerator called the Diamond Light Source in Oxfordshire at a resolution of about 4 micrometers per voxel, meaning each tiny 3-dimensional pixel was a fraction of the width of a human hair, and they released that data to the entire world. Then they put up prize money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They called it the Vesuvius Challenge, and the offer was blunt. Here is the scan. Read the scroll. First person to pull real, legible text out of it wins. They threw a 2,000-year-old cold case open to anyone on Earth with a laptop and the nerve to try. And thousands tried. Programmers, students, machine learning engineers, hobbyists, people who had never heard the name Philodemus in their lives. They downloaded the scans and started training artificial neural networks pattern recognition software to hunt for the faint texture of ink. Because here is the twist in the science. It was not really the lead they ended up chasing. As the contestants dug into the data, they realized the ink left another trace, a subtle difference in the surface texture of the papyrus wherever a letter had been written, a faint pattern the researchers nicknamed crackle. The ink sat on the fibers just differently enough that, at 4 micrometer resolution, a well-trained machine could learn to spot it, a whisper of texture no human eye could ever isolate. On October 12, 2023, a 21-year-old named Luke Ferreter, a college student who was interning at a rocket company, ran his model and saw something bloom out of the noise. Letters. Greek letters. A word. The word was porphyris. It means purple. I want you to feel the weight of that moment the way I did when I first read the timestamp on it. A young man sitting at a computer becomes the first person in nearly 2,000 years to read a word from inside a sealed scroll, and he did it without ever touching the scroll, which is still sitting whole, unopened, in a library in Paris. The word purple. Not opened, not unrolled, reads straight through the burnt closed cylinder by teaching a machine to see the ghost of ancient ink. Ferreter won the first letters prize. But that was only the opening crack. Because now the floodgates were open, and this is where the story stops being about technology and starts being about what these people were actually saying. Ferreter teamed up with a Berlin PhD student named Yusef Nader and a Swiss robotics student named Julian Schilliger. Nader had been refining his own model, pulling ink out of the scan with a clarity nobody had reached before. Together, in the final stretch of 2023, they turned their tools loose on the whole scroll. And in February of 2024, they claimed the grand prize. What they submitted was not a word. It was more than 2,000 characters of ancient Greek, spread across 15 columns of text, the largest continuous passage ever recovered from an unopened Herculaneum scroll. For the first time since the eruption, you could sit and read paragraphs of a book that had been sealed in carbon since before the fall of Rome. So, after all of that, the tunnels, the burning, the failed machines, the 270 years of surrender, the particle accelerators and the neural networks, what did the voice in the scroll actually say? This is the part I find genuinely stranger than any of us expected. Because we had braced ourselves for a lost tragedy, a secret history, a forgotten scripture. Instead, the author, almost certainly Philodemus, writing in the 1st century before Christ, was talking about pleasure. Specifically, he was arguing about whether things that are scarce are more pleasurable than things we have in abundance. Listen to how it opens in the recovered text. He writes in effect that in the case of food, we do not immediately believe that things which are scarce are more pleasant than those which are plentiful. He is picking a fight. He is arguing against other philosophers, likely the Stoics, who claimed that having less or wanting less was the path to a good life. And Philodemus, sitting in a luxurious seaside villa surrounded by bronze statues and fine art, is calmly making the opposite case. That scarcity does not automatically make a thing sweeter, that abundance has its own pleasures, and that the people who tell you otherwise have not thought it through. He talks about music, he talks about the pleasures of food and how they compare to the pleasures of the senses. And in the very last lines, the team recovered, he takes a direct swing at his intellectual opponents. The philosophers who preached that the good life meant self-denial, and essentially accuses them of having nothing coherent to say about pleasure at all. Think about what you are actually hearing. This is not a monument. This is not a sacred text carved for the ages. This is a man in a room, mid-argument, throwing an elbow at his rivals about whether it is better to have a lot or a little. It is a private, living, almost casual human voice, frozen at the exact instant the mountain came down. And the reason it survived at all is that it was buried by the very catastrophe that killed everyone who could have read it. But here is the piece that took this from a great discovery to the thing I truly cannot let go of. And it is the reason I said, at the very start, that the real answer was stranger than we thought. Everything I have described, the first scroll, the 2,000 characters, the whole triumphant story you may have seen in the headlines comes from reading a tiny handful of scrolls. And the villa of the papyri is not empty. Go back to Carl Weber's own maps from the 1750s, the survey drawings made by the men tunneling through the rock. Compare them to what has actually been excavated, and you find something that stops you cold. The villa was explored through narrow tunnels, room by room, and then, in 1765, the digging was sealed up and abandoned because of poisonous volcanic gases and the danger of collapse. Only a fraction of the building has ever been properly uncovered. Large sections of that villa, including levels that were never reached, are still down there, still buried under the town of Herculaneum, exactly as Vesuvius left them. And here is the detail buried in the layout that the celebration tends to skip. The room where the scrolls were found was a relatively small chamber, and the collection it held was overwhelmingly Greek, the working library of Philodemus. But a villa of that scale, owned by a wealthy and powerful Roman, many scholars believe it belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso. The father-in-law of Julius Caesar himself would almost certainly have kept a second library, a Latin one. The Romans of that class separated their Greek and Latin collections, and that main Latin library has never been found, because the part of the villa that would hold it has never been dug. Sit with that. Somewhere under a modern Italian town, At the bottom of a sealed tunnel first cut more than 250 years ago, there may be another library, hundreds or thousands more of these carbonized scrolls still lying on their shelves, still holding Latin words no one has read since the year 79. Lost histories, lost poetry, works we know existed only as names in other men's footnotes. The single richest cache of lost literature on the planet, and it is not gone. It is waiting, exactly where it fell. For 270 years, the reason we did not read the scrolls we already had was that opening them destroyed them. That excuse is now dead. We have proven you can read them without touching them. A 21-year-old with a laptop proved it. And yet the second library sits unexcavated, the tunnel sealed, the story treated in most places as a happy ending rather than the beginning we now know it to be. That is the thing that gets me. We spent centuries saying we could not read these books. Now we can. And the largest part of the collection is still in the ground, not because we cannot reach it, but because reaching it takes will, money, and the decision to keep the case open when the world would rather call it closed. So here's what I keep coming back to, sitting with all of this late at night. We were handed a second chance that no generation before us ever had the power to hear the dead speak without harming a single fiber of what they left behind. And the only question left is whether we care enough to finish digging. If you are the kind of person who feels that a sealed door is a question and not an answer, then you already understand why I could not leave this one alone. You do not take the tidy version. You want to know what is behind the wall. So let me ask you something specific, and I genuinely want your answer. The first word ever read from a sealed Herculaneum scroll was purple. If it were your hands on the next scroll, the first Latin one pulled from that buried library, what word are you hoping bleeds out of the noise first? Tell me in the comments. And tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read them and this is the crowd I want to hear from. If this is your kind of case, the ones everyone else filed away as solved or impossible, then stay with me, because we keep reopening them here, one buried thread at a time. There is another one I have been pulling on, a set of tunnels under a different ancient site, cut with a precision that the tools of the era should not have allowed. But that is a scroll for another night. I'm not stopping there. Inside my membership, the Unexplained Society, you'll get that charred library's every recovered scroll, decoded in full, picking up right where this video ended. Puzzled by something? Ask me directly, and a real person answers. Not a machine. You won't be doing this alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can cancel any time with one click. Now, if those scrolls surprised you, wait until you see what came next. Machines have quietly unlocked far older writings, revealing unsettling truths about where we truly come from. That story is starting right here. Stay with me.